It's Lillian Ardell, and welcome to Disrupting the Monolingual Bias. The idea of the monolingual bias is that here in the US we have this assumption that one nation means one language.
The monolingual bias is what people just assume is normal.
Monolingual bias is pretty pervasive in all areas of US contexts of schooling and education, and I'm also learning international contexts, where a goal is to get all of our students that might come with multilingual, other language proficiencies, get them to be speaking English, sometimes and often at the risk of losing access to their heritage language, which also is tied to their culture and their community.
One of the things that first comes to mind that I work on a lot with my teachers is a framework to think about how power and oppression operate, and then use that to talk about how monolingual bias and English supremacy oftentimes shows up.
What do you think is the fear of encroachment of the heritage of the home language coming in? What are these people concerned for?
You know, what people will say is, well, this isn't inclusive if English is what everybody speaks, right? However, I really think it's like uncomfortability. When you are in another country, it is uncomfortable if you don't understand the other language. Sometimes it's adults projecting onto monolingual kids who don't experience the discomfort. It's snack time. Of course, they're talking about a video game in another language, in Korean or in Hebrew, what have you, right? So I think it is this idea of sitting with discomfort.
There's this notion that runs through our schools and our country that English in the United States is the language of success. That may look like many standardized tests being in English only, college entrance essays being required in English, curriculum guides, even if they're in Spanish or in a language other than English for teachers, are written in English.
Yep.
And only the words that are supposed to be spoken directly to the child are in Spanish or the other language.
When I was a dual language bilingual teacher, it was assumed that if we teach in English and in Spanish, that was just enough. If we do the assessments in English and Spanish, that was just enough. And that we had to adhere to these rigid ideas of what language is. Mm-hmm. I think the monolingual bias, it's not just English, but it's also monolingual bias in Spanish. And I think that's where translanguaging has really kind of ruptured the conversation and inserted new ideas into what is language and how do children language.
Mm-hmm. This is a little bit of a paradox because we know that parents and teachers are all doing the very best that they can and want the best for the children that they're serving. Let's just make sure that we are both crystal clear on that position. So that monolingual bias, that you have tests that are only designed in English and that are measured against this nebulous proficiency that students have to improve upon in order to test out of their labels, that heritage languages are removed from students' instruction, and many of them don't get access to full biliteracy, literacy in English and then in the home language. Of course, those of us that are advocates in bilingual education TESOL spaces know that we want children and families to have rights to their language. And so we are organizing and advocating for full bilingualism and biliteracy. I guess what I'm trying to do with bringing visibility to disrupting the monolingual bias is that short of being the president or in a position like that of policy or larger curriculum writers, there is power that can come from the ground up.
If the text is in English and my student is a Spanish speaker, I'm going to ask them the comprehension questions in Spanish. And I think it should, at this point, be second nature that if you do have access to speak to a child, whether it's in Chinese, Arabic, or Spanish, about the comprehension questions, that should be our default.
One of the things that school leaders and teachers who have the ear of school leaders can do is advocate for things like trainings for bilingual teachers that are in multiple languages. So advocating for your school leaders to incorporate workshops that are in other languages that help us then support families and kids in multiple languages is one way that we can start to also tackle that institution. institutional barrier.
What would it look like if we finally overturned the monolingual bias and we had full bilingual celebrations and advantages in our system? What would that be? What would that look like for you? What would it sound like?
I think it's a wholeness. Like a wholeness for all people involved.